push the button, Mike.
Hey, folks, thanks for tuning in to the year 2022, and we are bringing back Owen Explains It All with Owen KC Stephens. How are you doing, sir?
Hi, folks. Good, good. I survived into a new year.
As did we all, thank goodness. And also surviving into the new year is our stalwart co-host, Jacob Leckman. Jacob, how are you, sir?
Pleasure to be here as always.
Good to have you. And joining us in this bright new year is our familiar theme song music. Just a second. I love that. Okay, so today, for those of you unfamiliar with Owen Explains It All as a concept, Owen KC Stephens talks about something fun happening in pop culture right now and how it can be brought to your gaming table, sometimes specifically as it regards Starfinder, the RPG, which Owen had a very big hand in. So today...
It's not so far always regarding Starfinder.
Indeed. And today we are talking about a movie that just showed up on Disney Plus like yesterday, the day before, Eternals for Marvel. And I will put the trailer up in the background. And Owen, turn the microphone over to you, sir.
So, as with all Owen Explains It All, when we're going to be going into cool things and how to apply them, spoilers. So if you have not seen this yet, hit pause, go watch this on Disney Plus, come back. So Eternals is interesting in a number of respects. It really goes back to some early Kirby stuff. Kirby, for the comic book fans, who ran into the concept of the Chariot of the Gods, the idea that aliens has visited Earth and had a strong impact on human development. And whether or not he bought that, he thought it was an interesting starting point for a comic book plot. And I agree with him, right? I don't believe in the vast majority of things that are happening in comics, but that doesn't mean that they aren't cool for comics. It's interesting because a lot of people think that the Eternals are very similar to the Inhumans. And of course, Inhumans had a television show that was not well received and are currently not really showing any evidence of showing up in the MCU. But the Eternals are a group of people with a connected origin who have a purpose and superpowers, but are not mutants, are not super soldiers, do not have a serum, are only sort of aliens. And they are, Mike was mentioning while we were waiting to go live, that like Guardians of the Galaxy, the Eternals are sort of a deep cut that there's a group of fans that are super excited about, and most other people are like, well, it's a Marvel movie, I'll go see it. And I don't know that as a movie, Eternals has done nearly as good a job as Guardians of the Galaxy did of providing something new and interesting for fans of the MCU. But as a concept, it has some really interesting stuff in it that I think you can borrow for your Starfinder game or other role-playing game, because one of the things it does is it presents, here's a new arc, here's a new set of powers, here's a new plot line, which in fact goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, even though we've been doing Marvel movies for a decade and we never mentioned them before now. And that is the sort of thing that shows up sometimes in role-playing games. If a role-playing game has a new expansion, let us say Tech Revolution for Starfinder, there can be new things in that you want to add to your Starfinder game, but that you feel like maybe someone would have noticed if there were people that could manipulate clouds of nanites, like the nanosite class in that book, and you haven't mentioned it at all. And then how do you bring that into your game in a way that makes sense and is consistent and doesn't invalidate everything you've done or cause people to say, hey, if there's this vast group of people with this whole new power, how come when we had the last adventure path where we were trying to save Absalom Station from destruction by an ancient race of aliens, they never showed up? So that is the kind of question that I think it can be useful to look at what does and doesn't work in other media to try and introduce it to your own. And the MCU version of the Eternals is a very specific adaptation. There have been some trade paperbacks. There have been some runs of comics. Some of the characters, Cersei and Gilgamesh in particular, have shown up like in the Avengers. Even in comics, the Eternals were always something that I enjoyed the concept of more than I have enjoyed the execution. I am a fan of the idea of a secret population of people that have powers and their own mission and their own background and rules that are set aside from regular society. That doesn't mean I think the Eternals does the best job with that concept. But since I am interested in the concept and its connections to Celestials, which are ginormous space gods in Marvel, I think it can be very interesting to go through and say, well, I like this. I think it works. I don't like this. I don't think that works. And sometimes looking at things that you think don't work and why they don't work for you can actually inspire you to come up with something better. Jacob was talking about his reaction to Eternals, which he carefully watched last night in preparation of this. So I want Jacob to give us his hot take.
Well, in general, while I don't intend this to be an Eternals movie review, I largely agree with the show's dear friend Christopher McLaughlin in that I'm not a big fan of Marvel's secret societies like the Eternals and the Inhumans. These people who have powers that are entirely separated from the rest of the Marvel universe, and yet are supposed to be big parts of it, but they don't do anything. Why are they there? Well, they're there because they were created back when Marvel was just getting big, and they interacted a lot with the big name heroes of the time. But they're, to be honest, I don't find them interesting. This movie did interesting things with characters that I don't particularly find appealing. So it was enjoyable. It was entertaining. And while I like the idea of Kirby Space Gods, the Eternals have never really been executed very well for me. I much prefer like the Apocalyptans and how they interact with the DC universe, and they are very active in the DC universe as bad guys. So yeah,
There's a certain vintage of Kirby stuff that sounds real interesting on paper, but then I look into it, like Captain Victory. I thought, well, this is right up my alley. Sci-fi soldier fighting an endless war who can clone himself and keep on going. Then I got into reading it, and I'm just like, yeah, no, not so much.
One of the huge issues I have, especially with the Eternals in the regard of their creation and how they're presented, is they are supposed to be the ancient space gods to whom all the actual mythological gods are based, except that in Marvel it already established all the mythological gods already exist. So what are these guys doing? Again, they serve no purpose.
And that is one of the interesting things about how to pull things together, right? I think you could very easily, if you're creating your own continuity, say, okay, there were these incredibly powerful entities, and interestingly, Eternals sort of are presented as space gods, and yet they are working for the real space gods, the Celestials, right? So you already have this weird two-tier system. Now, some of the Eternals do that better than others, right? One of the Eternals is Gilgamesh, and he is Gilgamesh. So that they are putting him forward as, okay, this is an incredibly powerful demigod hero figure who has been a lot of the heroes of ancient legend and history and mythology. And that works a little better than, say, Athena, where in fact she is competing with Athena, because Athena is an actual entity. But for me, one of the most interesting things about the Eternals as translated into the MCU was that they were given a unified aesthetic to their powers, even though their powers weren't all the same.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, some of them can fly, and some of them are strong and hard to hurt, and some of them are summoning weapons, and some of them are shooting bolts. But because their powers all came from this same source, that they were created by Celestials, they all had the same, let us say, golden glow outline aesthetic of what they did. And that is the sort of thing that I find really interesting to be able to, and they kind of put a lampshade on that within the MCU, that at the end they're looking at this eternal artifact and they're saying, well, it doesn't appear to be magic. It doesn't appear to be sci-fi. It's not based on Thanos. What the heck is it? And when I was watching the movie, I immediately found myself thinking about the Nanosite class. In Starfinder Tech Revolution, there's a new class, the Nanosite, that has a control over nanites that are also infused in their body, and you can control them in different ways. And one of the things you can do with them is to make equipment for yourself, manifest your nanites as gear. And that power felt very much like what we saw some of the people in the movie do, that Athena could create shields and weapons, and other people were doing gauntlets, and some people were doing, finger guns, all of which had this something is forming this equipment, and it looks and acts differently from other powers. So if I wanted to, there are two ways I could see going about this. I could easily see saying, hey, I really like the idea of a new power source that's maybe a hidden society, something that is outside the norm, that I'm adapting for my campaign, that I'm specifically making work within my game system. And there are a lot of things in Starfinder you can connect that to, right? There are a lot of specific mysteries. There's the Gap. There's what are the Greys doing? There are a lot of things that are set up as, here is a secret that probably Paizo is never going to reveal, which makes it a rich place for you to set material in your campaign, because there will never be an official answer that contradicts you. So I could easily saying, hey, if the Greys are one side in a secret war, who's the other side? And deciding that nanocytes are a faction that are opposing the Greys, or who actually know what happened during the Gap, or maybe even caused it, or are the main line of defense for the Aslanti Star Empire, right? Anything that takes them away from the norm and saying, hey, these aren't common in the Pact worlds, these aren't normal in the Veskarium, these are this whole different thing. And then you can open it up for both players and NPCs. So you can introduce it to your game. You can make NPCs. You could do the Green Lantern thing and find one that has a crucial mission that has to be fulfilled, and he's dying. And so he passes his nanite cloud to a PC who then can take levels in Nanosite.
I like that.
Yeah. And these are all options for how to bring something new into an ongoing campaign. And that is often one of the trickiest things. Way back when 3rd edition D&D was being created, one of the reasons prestige classes were a thing was that, having released the core rulebook and the monster manual and the DMG, there was a thought process that if we were introducing new classes, people would want to know, well, why couldn't I take that option back when I was a first level character? I'm doing this ongoing campaign. It doesn't make sense. Whereas with prestige classes, you earned into them. So a character could go, oh, okay, I didn't know this was an option, but I can now take it moving forward. And I understood that thought process. But even at the time, I thought, well, don't people change campaigns fairly quickly? When Pathfinder has added new classes, Pathfinder 1st edition, other than doing some contextualizing for how these things fit in their world of Galarian, they mostly haven't worried about it. And it has sometimes run into some oddities. There was a Magambian Arcanist archetype that wizards could take, because we had mentioned that Arcanists were a thing, and then an Arcanist class was released. And as it happens, an Arcanist does not qualify for the Magambian Arcanist wizard archetype. We wanted to have Winter Witches and Irison, so back when we didn't have witches necessarily, there was a Winter Witch prestige class, then there was a witch class, then there was a Winter Witch archetype for the witch class, which means in the Reign of Winter campaign, there are characters that are a witch, Winter Witch, Winter Witch. So some weirdness can come out of it, but for the most part, ever said, well, if there are witches and hexes, why did it never get mentioned before this? But I do think there is room when you've got a whole new power source, something that is radically different from what has come before, to introduce it as a brand new element that had not previously been exposed. And I think the Marvel movie can be a great, the Marvel Eternals MCU movie can be a great source of inspiration for how people might react to that, how it might look, and how to emulate that kind of feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thoroughly agree with that, and I don't mind the idea of there being, you know, secret hidden societies within a world. It's just they need to interact with the world to be relevant, you know. And so I did like the fact that in the Eternals they decided to be more part of the world, especially, you know, after what happened in the Indian Ocean, and you don't come back. You don't come back from that. And it's like, oh no, now we're going back, and we're gonna maintain low identities again. And no, that's not happening anymore.
Yeah, one of the things that frequently happens in comics, I was talking to my friend Stan about this the other day, is that great big massive events will occur and then have no lasting impact, right? Like Marvel's Secret Wars or Infinite Crisis. These things happened, and they were these multiple people, like a world war equivalent in the superhero community. And there are a few things that come out of them, right? Okay, the origin of Venom as the symbiote goes back to Secret Wars, but there's nothing about Venom that requires Secret Wars, as the 2 Venom movies from Sony have proven. They just skip that being where he happened to encounter Spider-Man and move on because they've created a totally different backstory.
So in the comics, how many times has Earth been invaded by aliens?
Yeah, I mean,
in DC Comics, I mean, boy, back in the 90s, Gotham was destroyed by an earthquake, and then for a solid year, it was just this no man's land rubble. And then, boop, it was all cleaned up in about a year, and we never talked about it anymore. Or to go back on subject, Eternals, at the end of Neil Gaiman's Eternals miniseries, a Celestial shows up in San Francisco and just kind of stands in a park and hangs out. And he left it there as kind of a dangling plateau for someone else to pick up. But as far as I know, no one ever did. So,
there's still just a Celestial standing there a mile high.
That happens in Marvel Comics kind of a lot. Like a writer goes out and, here's some toys y'all can play with. And everyone's like, nah, man, we're good. And they just go and do their own thing. So.
And, you know, that is part of what happens when you've got any medium where hundreds and thousands of stories are being told, right? You talk about Batman or Spider-Man or Wolverine, who have been in multiple comics that have 400, 500 issues. And you say, okay, when does this person get therapy for the 900 cases of trauma they run into? And sometimes people deconstruct a character or a concept and talk about those things. For a while, DC specifically had a Kryptonian super science therapy pod that heroes and villains could go into and express their issues with it. Doc Samson has been shown to do therapy for superheroes sometime. But one of the things that the MCU has this advantage of is that it's not doing thousands of stories. It's doing this concrete, slow advance. So things that in the comic books might happen and then seem to have no impact on daily life until they're mentioned again. Like, you know, all of New York was taken over by demons. Galactus and the Watcher stood in the sky and had a debate. And yet most citizens are still more worried about the rent and the mortgage and soccer practice, despite things like actual gods running around. But in the MCU, we have something like Thanos destroyed half of all life, and that is getting mentioned and talked about and having fallout. And you can argue about how well they're doing those things, like, you know, whether or not the Winter Soldier and Captain America, or Winter Soldier and the Falcon, depending on what you want to call it, handled things like, hey, there's a fallout from the blip. There are complications to the fact that people went away. 5 years passed. A new normal was established. Then people came back. Suddenly, resources are stretched in a way that they weren't, because while losing half of everything was horrible, it did mean that there was more space and there was more housing to go around, etc. And then who gets the house now if you bought it and someone else showed up and hasn't been 7 years, so they weren't necessarily declared dead, etc. And so I think it is interesting that they have taken the tack in the Eternals of saying these people were here and no one noticed them during the main continuity. And they've played with that before, right? When they were doing Ant-Man, we discovered that the original Ant-Man and the Wasp were running around and doing things for S.H.I.E.L.D., and no one knew about it. Thor mentions the fact that they actually interacted with the Norse, and no one knew about it. So there is sort of this through line of there are layers and things going on, and we're not necessarily telling those stories until we get to them. But I think it can be a great template for sometimes if you're running a campaign, you want to change things up. You want to make things more interesting. You want to introduce a new element. And there can be lots of ways to do that. If you're in a fantasy campaign, it can be as simple as everyone gets on a boat and sails to a new continent and discovers that there is a rich and vibrant culture of bunny centaurs there that have just, they're not mostly seafaring people and you haven't run into them. In sci-fi, it is quite easy to have travel be, you are going out and you're finding this uninhabited planet, and when you get there, there's a survey team who is looking at this uninhabited planet, having approached from the other side of the galaxy, and these two cultures are now, for the very first time, starting to overlap, and they had very little knowledge of each other previously. And that is a great opportunity to take things like new character classes, new power sources. I'm really interested in the nanosite as a new power source, and how that can emulate things that are different from gear use and psychic powers and magic and the things that we'd sort of set up from the get-go. We had sort of hinted that mecha were around, and we had 30-foot tall suits of powered armor, so those concepts were in the game. But the nanosite is really something different, and of course one of the reasons I'm excited about it is I had nothing whatsoever to do about creating it, so I get to experience it for the first time, whereas I had developed pretty much all of at some stage of development, helped to develop all the previous classes, so they were all things that were not new or well known to me by the time they were published. I think that there are some interesting things you can do. The nanosite specifically has a few different modes. They can do clouds, they can create gear, and I think there are some things you could do to break down that even more. I am planning to do a more Eternal-like use nanites to create your specialty gear set of options for the nanosite, which should be up on my blog Monday. Where normally I would have it earlier in the week, but it's been a busy week, and we're not getting to. We frequently do this on Monday, and today we're doing the show on Thursday. So next Monday I will have out my Eternal-inspired nanosite options on my blog, which Mike's got up right now. But I am really interested to see where Marvel takes these new introductions. And one of the problems you get into anytime you've got too many ongoing stories is that things can become old hat. You can watch James Bond movies and the tone changes, the actor changes, but they're still basically all this sort of specific kind of spy story. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe has very carefully tried to done, okay, here's a war movie, here's a heist movie, here's a buddy film. And they're now introducing new elements. You've got the 10 Rings from Shang-Chi, you've got the Eternals, you've got the time travel stuff and the Time Variance Authority. And these are all things that have been going on in the background, but just weren't the focus of the story. And now they are boiling to the surface. They've got the multiverse stuff, for that matter, with Spider-Man, and then later this year, the Multiverse of Madness. So they've got, rather than just doing the same sets of stories, at least on the surface, they're changing things up. Now, it's true that in the Eternals, they basically have to fight evil versions of themselves with the same powers. And in Shang-Chi, he basically has to fight an evil version of himself with the same power, just like Iron Man had to fight an evil Iron Man, and Thor had to fight an evil Asgardian, and the Hulk had to fight the Abomination. There are some tropes that they are still hitting pretty hard, but by bringing in more powers and more elements and more sources and more kinds of conflict, I think there is a real opportunity to have a change up where the audience accepts, okay, Doctor Strange is a sorcerer, Iron Man is a guy in powered armor, Thor is a space god, which means that since we've seen all these, we could have a suit of powered armor face off against Doctor Strange, and everyone would understand what was going on. And that is the sort of slow burn introduction of new power sources, new character concepts, new conflicts, and I think can be very useful as a model when trying to change things up and introduce new elements to your RPG campaign.
So maybe I missed this earlier, but we're talking about the Nanosite class for Starfinder. Has that been published officially yet, or is that still in playtest?
No, that's in Tech Revolution, which is out. You can also find it on Archives of Nethes, which is aonsrd.com. So you don't have to pick up the book. You can go grab it. I'll be pointing to that when I put up my blog post about it. At the end of first edition Pathfinder, there were 30-something official character classes, not including alternate classes and things like the Vampire Hunter and the Omedra, the stuff that were made for specific tie-ins. And Starfinder is very specifically going more slowly. So we had the original set of 7 classes, and then we had 3 more that we added in the Character Operations Manual. And now we are adding 1 more here, and there is still a precog in playtesting right now, which should come out with a big Galactic Magic book that's on the schedule. But I was one of the people, I got to do some freelance development on Tech Revolution, so I was aware of the book and got a copy, which I don't have sitting next to me, so I was working on it in the other room. But there's some really cool stuff in there, and a lot of people have been so excited about the fact that Tech Revolution has mecha rules, which have some really interesting choices, which when a mecha pop culture thing comes along, I'm sure I will be telling you how to tie in. But it's also got the Nanosite class, which is a new and interesting tech-driven class, but it is an internalized technology different from gear boosts from a soldier or the magical manipulation of technology like the Technomancer.
Cool. Well, you can find Tech Revolution for Starfinder on Paizo's store right now, or it's on Amazon as well. And we are heading dangerously close to the 30-minute mark. And when I pitched the idea for the show to Owen a few months back, my big pitch was short, fast, fun, and done in 30 minutes. So as we are heading towards that 30-minute mark, any closing remarks, things we want to wrap up on, Owen?
I think that I will once again hammer that if you are looking for things for your Starfinder game, in current pop culture, it is really easy to look at almost any superhero genre that frequently mixes magic and technology and aliens, especially now, as a source for inspiration. And I don't think you necessarily want to try and duplicate what either the DC movies or the Marvel movies, or for that matter, the animated show on Amazon, Invincible. But they can be a great place to look at for, this is a neat concept. How would I do that in Starfinder, to give you a set of guidelines?
Cool. Jacob, closing thoughts, sir.
If you enjoy content like this, please support the Banff Patreon.
I appreciate you mentioning that. We should probably revamp the Banff Patreon here in the new year to update it and retool it and put some of that new car smell inside of it. So
we should also probably come up with a way for the Owen KC Stephens Patreon to point at Banff and for Banff to point at Owen KC Stephens, which should have been an obvious thought I should have had 2 years ago, but just occurred to me on the air.
Well, we've only been doing this for about 8 months now, so yeah, 2 years requires some prophetic powers on your part, sir. But it's all right.
I try to have prophetic powers. It's a good business plan.
I have nightly experiments in seeing myself that have yet to bear fruit, but one day.
And if we had prophetic powers, we would be on top of the RPG game as opposed to being third stringers.
Oh, I don't know that you're a third stringer. I think you're a solid second stringer, my friend.
And
third stringers don't have other people in the industry mentioning them and pointing to them regularly, and you do. So,
thank you, Jason.
I've only been at this for more than 20 years, so.
And thank you, Casey. Appreciate that. So let's play the outro music because, boy, I do love that. And we will see you folks hopefully next week on Owen Explains It All. Probably back on our usual Monday time slot, but we'll figure things out. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, folks.